There was never a cookbook. Not for the things that mattered. Ask her for a recipe and she'd say flour, buttermilk, a little of this, a little of that. You'd write it down, go home, and fail. Because the recipe was never the ingredients. It was her hands, the way she pressed the dough, the sound of oil right before it was ready, the smell that told her greens were done 10 minutes early. This wasn't ignorance. It was mastery so complete it never needed writing down. Black grandmothers across the rural South built a science of food and taught it by hand. We lost most of it. Today, we get 25 pieces back, number 25. Seasoning cast iron with fatback, seasoning skillets with fatback instead of oil. In 1940s, 50s rural Georgia, a new cast iron pan wasn't seasoned with anything store-bought. A woman took a scrap of fatback, hog fat trimmed off, worth almost nothing, sometimes given away free, and rubbed it into the hot iron until it turned black and glass slick. The kitchen filled with a smokehouse smell. That pan outlived her. Fatback cost about 8 cents a pound in 1945. A palm-sized scrap seasoned a skillet for a decade. Today, cast iron seasoning oil sells online for $12. She used what nobody wanted, and it worked better. Number 24. The Buttermilk Soak Number 24. Soaking tough meat in buttermilk overnight. Cheap cuts were all a Delta family could afford. Round steak, tough as a boot heel. So she'd drop it in buttermilk before bed, letting it sit in the icebox or the coolest corner of the kitchen. Buttermilk was often free. The watery leftover from churning butter, saved instead of dumped. Food scientists later explained that lactic acid breaks down muscle fiber, tenderizing meat molecularly. She had no lab, no degree, just the knowledge that soaked meat cut easier by morning. That's chemistry, discovered by a woman using a byproduct she refused to waste. Number 23. Bacon grease in a coffee can. The coffee can of bacon grease sitting by every Deep South stove. You knew it on sight. Rust at the rim, label long gone, always within arm's reach of the burner, from the 1930s through the 1960s. Every strip of bacon left something behind, and none of it went down the drain. It went in the can, and the can seasoned everything after. Greens, cornbread, a Sunday fried egg. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. There was no other name needed. It cost nothing, came from something already paid for, and made everything taste like her kitchen alone. Number 22. Pot liquor from boiled green, keeping the pot liquor instead of pouring it out. In 1930s, 40s, low country South Carolina, collard and turnip greens simmered for hours, and what remained in the pot was never treated as waste. It was darker than broth, richer, ladled over crumbled cornbread and called supper on its own. This wasn't leftover water. It was the greens surrendering their iron, calcium, and vitamins into a liquid that cost nothing and fed a family twice. Decades before bone broth appeared on menus for $11 a cup, pot liquor was doing the same job for free in a coffee-stained pot on a wood stove. Number 21. Cornmeal as a meat stretcher. In the Alabama Black Belt, during the worst years of the Depression, meat was the most expensive thing in the kitchen, and cornmeal was the cheapest, 3 cents a pound, so she mixed the two. Ground meat stretched with cornmeal, and a little onion became a dish that fed 8 instead of 4. And nobody at that table went hungry, and nobody could tell the difference by taste. That is not a trick to be ashamed of. That is math done with a skillet instead of a calculator, and it worked every single time. Number 20. The sweet not sauté onion method in Louisiana kitchens through the 1940s and 50s. Onions went into a pot with a lid on, over the lowest flame the stove had, and stayed there, not to brown, but to soften and release their sugar without a drop of butter needed. 20 minutes of patience turned a sharp onion into something sweet enough to eat on its own. No recipe card ever explained why this worked. She just knew low heat and time pulled sweetness out of a vegetable that high heat would only burn. That is not a shortcut. That is restraint, and restraint is the hardest ingredient to teach. Number 19. Sugaring vinegar to balance bitter greens. Mustard greens and turnip tops carry a bitterness that can close your throat if it's not handled right. And in the North Carolina Piedmont through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the fix was a splash of vinegar cut with just enough sugar to soften the edge without sweetening the dish. Sugar was rationed and precious, but a few pennies worth stretched across a whole pot of greens. This was not a garnish. This was balance. Acid against bitter, sweet against sharp, worked out through years of tasting, not a chemistry textbook. No cookbook of the era ever printed the ratio because there was no ratio. There was only her spoon and her tongue, and knowing when it was right. Number 18. Cracklins rendered from Hog Killing Day. Scraps Hog Killing Day in rural Mississippi during the 1930s and 40s was a communal event. Neighbors gathering to do the brutal, necessary work of slaughtering and processing a hog that would feed several families through winter. Nothing was wasted. The skin, cut into pieces and rendered slow in a black kettle over an open fire, crackled and popped until it turned into something crisp enough to shatter between your teeth. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Cracklins cost nothing because they came from parts of the hog a butcher today would throw in the trash. Now walk into any gas station and you'll find a bag of pork rinds for $6, made in a factory, sold back to us as a snack. That is not progress. That is someone charging us for the part we used to get for free. Number 17. Using a flour sack as a cheesecloth flour and cornmeal came packaged in cotton sacks in Texas and Georgia sharecropper cabins throughout the 1930s, and those sacks never went in the trash once they were empty. Washed clean, they became dish towels, diapers, dress fabric, and when something needed straining, a flour sack did the job cheesecloth does today for a cost of exactly nothing. Nothing bought once was used only once. Every piece of packaging had a second job waiting for it, and a third after that. Number 16. The hand test for biscuit dough, no measuring cups. Ask a grandmother in Alabama or Tennessee in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s how much flour went into her biscuits, and she'd tell you enough, and mean it completely. She worked the dough with her fingers until it told her it was ready. Not sticky, not dry, soft as an earlobe, she'd sometimes say. Humidity changed the flour. The flour changed the dough, and she adjusted every single time without ever touching a measuring cup. That is not the absence of a recipe. That is a recipe so deeply understood it lived entirely in her hands. Number 15. Smothering meat in its own gravy to make it last 2 days in the Arkansas Delta through the 1930s and 40s, a single piece of meat, often the cheapest cut available, was browned, then covered completely in a thick gravy made from its own drippings, flour, and water, and simmered low until it was tender enough to fall apart. Served over rice one night, it reappeared the next day. The gravy stretched a little further with more flour and water. Still rich, still filling. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Today's meal prep influencers call this batch cooking and sell online courses teaching it for $40. She was doing it in a cast iron pot in 1938 because there was no other way to make one piece of meat feed a family twice. Number 14. Using coffee grounds to deepen gravy color without burning it coffee was rationed and expensive in South Carolina kitchens of the 1940s, and even after the pot was brewed, the grounds didn't go straight in the trash. A pinch stirred into a pale gravy deepened its color to something rich and dark, without the bitter, burned taste that comes from cooking flour too long trying to get that same shade. This was not waste. This was a woman who had already gotten her coffee out of those grounds, finding one more use before she'd let them go. Number 13. The Sunday-only sugar rule sugar cost 8 cents a pound in 1933. expensive enough that a Depression-era household in the rural South measured it out carefully across 6 days. Barely any in the coffee, none in the cornbread. So that Sunday, the one day that mattered, could taste like celebration. A cake, a sweetened tea, a dessert that felt like abundance because every other day had felt like discipline. That is not deprivation. That is a woman deciding with almost nothing which day of the week her family got to feel rich. Stop and look at what's happened in the last 20 years. Bone broth, batch cooking, fermentation, nose-to-tail eating. Every single one of these ideas has been repackaged, trademarked, and sold back to us as a wellness breakthrough. Something new, something premium, something a chef in a white coat discovered. Bone broth sells for $11 a cup in cities where nobody's grandmother ever had to pay for it. Because Potliker was already doing that job in 1935 for free in a pot on a wood stove in the Mississippi Delta. This is the part that should make you angry. The food industry didn't invent these techniques. It found them already sitting in black Southern kitchens, refined over generations, tested by necessity, passed hand to hand. And it waited until the women who built them were old or gone, and then it put a price tag on their genius and called it a trend. That is not innovation. That is theft with better branding. Number 12. Reviving stale cornbread with buttermilk and bacon grease. Cornbread gone hard and dry by the second day wasn't thrown to the chickens first, not until every other use was tried. In Georgia kitchens of the 1930s and 40s, crumbled stale cornbread got soaked in buttermilk, softened, then fried again in bacon grease until the edges turned golden. What came out the other side barely resembled what went in. Nothing was ever really gone. It was only waiting for the next idea. Number 11. The low fire, long-time rule for dried beans, cost 5 cents a pound in Mississippi kitchens of the 1930s through 50s, and they rewarded patience in a way nothing else in the pantry did. Rushed on high heat, they split and turned to mush. Left low for hours, they softened evenly and drank up whatever seasoning meat had gone in with them, turning into something creamy enough to eat with just a spoon. A timer can't replicate that kind of patience. Patience was the ingredient, and it was free, and it took years to learn how much of it a pot of beans actually needed. Number 10. Using ham hocks to season a whole pot, then reusing them ham hocks were the cheap cut. The joint, mostly bone and skin, sold for pennies because no one else wanted it. But simmered in a pot of greens, it released fat and flavor into everything around it. And when the greens were gone, that same hawk went into a pot of beans 2 days later, and after that into a pot of soup, still giving something up each time. She was right. Everything she knew was right. 1 piece of meat, 3 meals, and nobody at that table ever tasted like they were eating scraps. Number 9. Salting watermelon rind before pickling for crunch in the low country of South Carolina in the 1940s. The white rind left after a watermelon was eaten didn't go in the trash. Salted first and left to sit, it drew out water and firmed up the flesh, so that when it finally went into a sweet, spiced, pickling brine, it came out with a crunch that soft rind never could have held. Today, that same pickled rind shows up on charcuterie boards in restaurants, priced at $14 alongside imported cheese. Grandma just called it not throwing away half a watermelon. Number 8. The wet hand trick for forming cornbread without sticking a silent rule, taught the same way across kitchens in Alabama and beyond through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Dip your hands in water before you touch the batter, and it slides off clean instead of clinging in thick, frustrating clumps. Nobody wrote it in a recipe. You learned it by watching her do it once, then trying it yourself and understanding immediately why it mattered. That is the whole architecture of how this knowledge survived. Not on paper. In the body, passed from her hands to yours. Number 7. Frying in batches to keep oil temperature steady, no thermometer, in Louisiana and Georgia kitchens of the 1940s, dropping too much chicken into the pot at once dropped the oil's temperature and left you with greasy, undercooked meat. So she fried in small batches, and she knew the oil was ready by the sound it made when a drop of water hit it, by the faint shimmer of heat rising off the surface, by smell alone. There was no dial to read. There was only 20 years of standing at that same stove, learning what ready sounded like. Number 6. Stretching a chicken across 3 meals-in Mississippi Delta households during the worst years of the Depression, a single chicken was too valuable to eat in one sitting. Night 1, it was fried, the best pieces first. Night 2, what remained went into a pot with rice and vegetables. Night 3, the bones simmered into a broth that became the base of soup, giving up the last of what they had to offer. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know, that bone broth on night 3 wasn't a garnish. Simmered bones release calcium and collagen into the liquid around them. Real, measurable nutrition. Extracted from a part of the chicken most people today throw away without a second thought. In the 1930s and 40s, nutritionists at Tuskegee University and other black land-grant institutions across the South did something no one expected. They walked into kitchens like these and studied them, formally, scientifically, with the same rigor they'd apply to any laboratory. And what they found, over and over, was that the techniques already being used by black Southern women were nutritionally sound. Pot liquor really was vitamin-dense. Simmered bones really did deliver calcium. Beans cooked low and slow really did retain more nutrients than beans boiled hard and fast. They knew things about food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Not because they had laboratories, because they had generations of watching, tasting, adjusting, and passing it forward, a research method with no name, running quietly in kitchens the rest of the country never thought to study until it was almost too late. Number 5. Using leftover grits as a base for fried cakes, the next morning in Georgia and South Carolina kitchens of the 1930s through 50s, grits made the night before never got thrown out if there was extra. Left to cool and firm up overnight, they were sliced the next morning and fried in a little bacon grease until crisp on the outside, soft within, an entire breakfast built from something already paid for the day before. Nothing in that kitchen had a single use. Everything had a second life waiting for it, if you knew how to see it in for. The onion and garlic rub instead of bottled marinade number 4. Rubbing meat directly with fresh onion and garlic instead of reaching for a bottled marinade. In Louisiana Creole households of the 1940s, seasoning meat meant crushing garlic and onion by hand and working it directly into the flesh, sometimes hours before cooking, letting it sit and penetrate. There was no bottle involved, no added sugar, no preservative, just 2 ingredients and time. This was not a marinade. This was something closer to alchemy, worked entirely by hand, and it never once needed a label listing what was inside it because you already knew number 3, souring milk on purpose for cornbread number 3. Letting milk turn sour on purpose, then folding it straight into the cornbread batter. In rural Alabama Depression-era kitchens, milk that was about to spoil wasn't dumped down the drain. It was used deliberately, the acidity reacting with baking soda to make cornbread rise lighter and taste faintly tangy in a way sweet milk never could produce. What looked to an outsider like spoilage was, in her kitchen, the secret ingredient the whole recipe depended on. Number 2. The Sunday pot that never got washed between batches number 2. A cast iron pot, wiped but never scrubbed clean, carrying the flavor of every meal cooked in it before. Across the Deep South from the 1930s through the 50s, a well-used pot wasn't washed with soap the way we do today. It was wiped, seasoned, and left to hold on to the fat and flavor built up over years, sometimes decades, of cooking. That pot got passed down, mother to daughter, still carrying the ghost of every gravy and every pot of beans that came before. This was not a failure to clean. This was flavor treated as inheritance, something you couldn't buy, couldn't fake, and couldn't get in under 50 years of daily use. Number one, teaching by standing, not by writing. None of it was ever written down, because none of it was ever meant to be read. You learned to cook the way you learned to walk, by standing next to someone who already knew how, watching her hands, and trying again until your body understood what your mind couldn't have written on a page. A recipe card can tell you 2 cups of flour. It cannot tell you what the dough should feel like against your palm on a humid August afternoon in Alabama. Only she could teach you that, and only by standing there, letting you fail in front of her until you didn't fail anymore. That is not a gap in the historical record. That is the reason the record was never going to exist in the first place. Closing, she taught the hand test for biscuits without ever touching a measuring cup. She stretched 1 chicken across 3 nights and let the bones finish what the meat started. She kept a Sunday pot that was never truly washed because the flavor in it was worth more than clean. None of that made it into a cookbook, and it never needed to. A cookbook sells you a technique. She was never selling anything. She was surviving with dignity, feeding her family with genius the rest of the country wouldn't recognize as genius for another 80 years. And the food industry has spent the last 2 decades charging us for the privilege of relearning what she already knew for free. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. Number 7. Eggs Benedict and English muffins split and toasted, topped with a slice of ham, an egg poached soft enough to break open on the first cut. All of it covered in a hollandaise sauce gone thick and pale yellow. 25 cents, served at hotel speakeasy brunches across New York in the late 1920s. Brunch itself was new in the 1920s, a meal invented almost entirely to give midday drinking somewhere respectable to happen. Nobody questioned a man ordering a mimosa at 11 in the morning if there was a plate of eggs in front of him. The meal was the alibi. The hollandaise was the cover story. This was not breakfast. This was the invention of an entire excuse. Number 6. Welsh rarebit, sharp cheddar melted slow with beer and a little mustard until it turned into a thick, pourable sauce, poured hot over toast until the bread went soft underneath and crisp at the edges. 15 cents, and in New York, the dish that let an entire speakeasy legally call itself a restaurant. Late-night supper laws in some cities required an establishment to actually serve food after a certain hour to keep operating at all. Welsh rarebit was fast, cheap, and technically a full meal. Cheese, bread, and a sauce made partly with beer, which speakeasies could claim, with a straight face, was simply for flavor. This was not a snack. This was the fine print of the law, melted onto toast. Number 5. Lobster Newburg. Lobster meat folded into a sauce of cream, egg yolk, and a splash of sherry, cooked just until it thickened, served in a shallow dish with the lobster still glistening under the sauce. $1.25, more than most men in 1928 made in half a day's work, and exactly the point. High-end Manhattan speakeasies served lobster Newburg because bootleg money had nowhere else to go. You couldn't deposit it. You couldn't explain it. But you could spend it on a $1 lobster dish in a room nobody official was supposed to know existed, and feel, for 1 hour, like the money meant something. This was not dinner. This was a fortune eating itself in public. Number 4. Steak tartare, beef chopped raw and fine by hand, mixed cold with capers, onion, and a raw egg yolk on top, served with nothing cooked anywhere near it. 35 cents, served in the German-run cellar clubs of New York. There was a practical reason raw dishes showed up so often in speakeasy kitchens, beyond the taste. No cooking meant no smell drifting up through the floorboards, no smoke pulling attention from the street, No evidence of a kitchen running at hours a legal restaurant had no business being open. Steak tartare was silent food, served in a room that needed to stay that way. That is not a delicacy. That is a kitchen trying not to get caught. Number 3. Beef stroganoff. Strips of beef seared fast and hot, simmered briefly in a sauce of sour cream and mushroom until it went pale and rich, poured over egg noodles still steaming from the pot. 25 cents, served in the Russian Jewish immigrant speakeasies of the Lower East Side. On the menu, it was billed as continental cuisine, sophisticated, European, worth the price. In the kitchen, it was an immigrant recipe carried straight across an ocean, cooked the same way it had been cooked in homes that had nothing to do with Manhattan at all. The dish didn't change. Only the price tag and the accent it was sold under did. This was not fine French cooking. This was somebody's grandmother's recipe, wearing a different name to survive in a new country. Number 2. Oysters Rockefeller. Oysters on the half shell, topped with a green mixture of butter, herbs, and breadcrumbs, broiled until the top went dark and crisp, while the oyster underneath stayed cool and barely cooked. 40 cents a half dozen, roughly 10 times what oysters cost on an open-air stand just a few blocks away. In New Orleans, this was the dish a speakeasy used to justify everything else on the bill. A room could charge whatever it wanted for supper, if the supper looked expensive enough, and oysters dressed up under a broiler with butter and herbs looked like exactly the kind of meal that came with a cover charge attached. The oysters weren't really the product. The room was. The oysters just made it believable. That is not seafood. That is a price tag with a shell around it. Number 1. Rum cake. A dense, dark cake soaked through with actual rum, baked until the top went sticky and caramelized, served as dessert under the name fruit cake on menus that needed to look perfectly innocent if anyone ever asked to see one. 15 cents a slice, and the single boldest dish on this entire list. Here it is, the last item, and the one that says everything. Every other dish on this countdown hid the crime somewhere nearby. This one put it directly on the plate. A federal agent could have ordered a slice of fruit cake off a perfectly legal-looking menu and eaten Prohibition's exact violation without ever knowing it. That is not dessert. That is the entire 13 years of this era, baked into something sweet enough that nobody thought to ask what was really inside it. Closing 30 plates. 30 alibis. Men poached eggs and called it brunch so they could drink at noon. They simmered onions for 8 hours in a room built for 8-minute transactions because some things refused to rush even when everything around them did. They soaked a cake in rum and called it fruit cake, and dared anyone to ask twice. None of this was an accident. The cooks behind these doors, most of them never named on a single ledger, never credited on a single menu, understood exactly what they were covering for, and they built food good enough to make federal agents forget to look closer. They were not garnish. They were the operation. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The modern restaurant, the modern brunch menu, the modern idea of a supper club, all of it was built in basements by people the law was actively hunting, and we never gave them credit for the invention. That is not prohibition. That is theft. Of names, of credit, of an entire era's worth of genius, hidden so well it took 100 years to even ask the question. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother or your grandfather, behind a bar he never talked about, actually made. Number 21. Government cheese and commodity casserole. You knew it by the box before you ever tasted a bite of it, plain cardboard, block-lettered, no branding on it at all, sitting on a folding table at the distribution site with a line of women waiting their turn in the cold, powdered milk in a paper sack, canned meat with a label that told you almost nothing, A 5-pound brick of orange cheese so dense you needed both hands and a real knife to get through it clean. Grandma melted it down slow over noodles, over rice, over whatever vegetable happened to be cheapest that particular week at the store, and turned government surplus into something that tasted like it came from somewhere with love already built into it. Because it did. It always did. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1981, federal commodity food programs tightened significantly, and for a short controversial stretch, a proposal in Washington briefly counted ketchup toward a vegetable serving on school lunch trays. It made national headlines. It made a lot of people angry, and rightfully so. But in the kitchens where this food was actually cooked, night after night, nobody was sitting down to read a policy memo from Washington. Grandma read the same thing she always read: the grocery bill on the counter, the calendar on the wall, the number of mouths that would be sitting at her table by 6 o'clock, and she adjusted the way she always had, without a headline and without a single complaint spoken out loud. That is not resignation. That is not progress either, no matter what anyone in an office decided to call it that year. That is a woman doing math nobody else in the building was doing for her every single week, and getting it right anyway. Number 20. Grits and tomato gravy. Down in coastal Carolina and across rural Georgia, breakfast most mornings wasn't eggs and bacon laid out on a plate. It was a pot of stone-ground grits, slow stirred until they turned from grainy to silk under the wooden spoon, then topped with a gravy built from canned tomatoes, a little flour, a spoonful of bacon fat, and whatever seasoning happened to be sitting in the cabinet that week. 20 cents a serving, maybe less if the tomatoes were on sale. It was built to hold a body until supper, thick enough to sit heavy in your stomach through a full day of work in the heat, and it did that job every single morning without fail, rain or shine, paycheck or no paycheck. Number 19. Fried fatback. The butcher practically gave it away, a slab of pure pork fat, no meat clinging to it at all, trimmed straight off the side and sold for pennies because nobody with money in their pocket wanted it. Grandma sliced it thin, fried it low and slow until the edges curled up and crackled loud in the skillet, and saved the rendered grease left behind to season an entire pot of greens later that same week. Nothing that left this kitchen ever left with just one job to do. The fatback itself was breakfast on Monday. The grease it left behind was Tuesday's collards and Wednesday's cornbread batter after that. That is not waste, and it was never treated as waste. That is a woman who understood exactly what she had in front of her, down to the last drop of fat in the pan. Number 18. Pickled pig's feet. 30 cents a pound along the Gulf Coast, sold whole, simmered for hours until the cartilage went soft and the meat pulled loose from the bone on its own, then packed into a mason jar with vinegar, red pepper flakes, and whatever spice happened to be within reach on the shelf. They sat on the counter or in the icebox, sealed tight, ready whenever hunger showed up uninvited between paydays, which it always did eventually. This was preservation as a survival skill. The exact same instinct that built root cellars and canning shelves out in the country, just repurposed for a two-bedroom apartment with no yard to speak of and no root cellar to fall back on. Number 17, pig ears. A quarter to 50 cents a pound in New Orleans and the rural parishes surrounding it, and most people in this country looked at a pig's ear and saw absolutely nothing worth cooking. Grandma saw cartilage that turned tender with enough patience and enough time on the stove, a blank canvas for hot sauce and vinegar, a texture that snapped clean between your teeth in a way no other cut in that kitchen ever did. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The parts of the hog they mark down as waste, the parts nobody in a boardroom ever thought twice about, were exactly the parts that fed the families who could not afford to waste a single thing that came into their kitchen.